Welcome to Sleepy Beep. Tonight we're going to slow down together and spend some time with one of the most misunderstood books ever written. A small book written 500 years ago by a man who watched power up close, lost everything, and then sat down at a desk to tell the truth about how the world actually works. You don't need to know anything about history or politics or philosophy to listen tonight. There's nothing to figure out. Nowhere else to be. If you've ever sat in a meeting and felt the room tilt against you, or watched someone else take credit for your work, or wondered why being good at your job somehow wasn't enough, then this is for you, exactly as you are tonight. So before we begin, take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the day you carried set itself down on the floor beside the bed. Wherever you are, whatever time it reads on the clock you can't quite see in the dark, let yourself settle in. And if you feel like it, you can share what time it is and where you're listening from. There's something kind about knowing other people are out there in the dark too. All of us, quietly drifting toward the same sleep. Thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Beep. Let us begin. Here is the most famous sentence in the history of office politics, the one you've probably heard, the one that gets quoted on posters and in boardrooms and by people who want to sound a little dangerous. It is better to be feared than loved.
That's it, that's the line everybody knows. 400 years of reputation hanging off those few words. And here's the strange thing, the thing almost nobody tells you. That sentence isn't finished. What you've been handed is only half of it. The man who wrote it didn't stop there, and the half they leave out, or the part that gets clipped off and thrown away, is the part that actually keeps you employed. It's the part that changes the whole meaning.
And once you hear it, you can never quite go back to the cartoon version again, but we'll get there. We'll get there slowly because that half sentence has a whole life behind it, and the life is the thing that makes the lesson land. For now, just hold the puzzle gently in your mind. The most quoted line in the entire conversation about power, and it's only the front half of the thought. Somebody, somewhere along the way, decided you only needed to hear the scary part. The man who wrote it was named Niccolo Machiavelli. He was born in 1469 in Florence, and he died in 1527, and his name, over the centuries, turned into a kind of curse word. You've heard it? Machiavellian. We use it to mean cold, scheming, manipulative, two-faced. The boss who plays his people against each other. The colleague who smiles at you in the hallway while quietly arranging your downfall. When we call someone Machiavellian, we mean they've read the dark playbook and they're using it on us. The word itself has come to mean snake. And here is where the night's first real surprise lives. That reputation, that whole frightening costume the name wears, is mostly a lie. It's a smear. It's a caricature that got loose and ran for 500 years, while the actual man and the actual book sat quietly on the shelf, saying something much subtler and honestly much kinder than anyone remembers. Let me show you how the smear got made, because it's a strange and human story. Machiavelli wrote his little book and then he died, and for a while it was just a book. But then it started to frighten people. About 50 years after his death, a French writer named Innocent Gentilet published a furious attack on it. The work is usually called the Contre Machiavel, the Against Machiavelli, and it came out in 1576. Gentile took the book, pulled out its sharpest lines, stripped away the reasoning around them, and held them up as proof that this Italian was teaching the world to be evil. He built a monster out of fragments, and the monster was popular. Monsters usually are. Around the same time, the theatres of England fell in love with that monster. On the Elizabethan stage, a whole stock character appeared, the Machiavel. A grinning, gleeful villain who steps to the front of the stage, tells the audience how wicked he's about to be, and then goes off to do it with relish. Shakespeare himself reaches for the name. He writes of the murderous Machiavel, tossing it out as a kind of shorthand for the most cynical schemer imaginable. So picture it. Picture an audience in a wooden theatre 400 years ago, watching a man in a black costume rub his hands together and confess his plots, and somewhere in their minds, the name of a dead Florentine clerk is getting welded permanently onto the idea of pure, calculated evil. And so that's where Machiavellian really comes from. Not from people reading the book, from people watching a villain, and from a furious pamphlet, and from the simple, human pleasure of having someone to point at and call the devil. The church helped seal it. In 1559, Machiavelli's works were placed on the Index of Prohibited Books, the official list of writings the faithful were forbidden to read. And there's an old folk legend which we should only ever treat as a legend, never as a fact, that even the nickname Old Nick for the devil supposedly comes from his first name, Niccolo. That's almost certainly just a story people told, but notice how perfectly it fits the costume. It's so satisfying to believe that the word for cunning and the word for the devil came from the same frightened place. The truth is plainer. A man wrote a book that told some uncomfortable truths about how power really moves, and the world found it easier to call him a demon than to sit with what he'd actually said. So who was he really underneath all that? Let's go and meet the actual man, because he's nothing like the grinning villain on the stage. Niccolo Machiavelli was for most of his working life a civil servant, a government official. He held a post in Florence as the head of what was called the Second Chancery of the Florentine Republic, and he served the Republic for 14 years. 14 years. Think about what that means. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a warlord, he was the man who handled the correspondence, who ran the diplomatic missions, who got sent off to negotiate with rulers and report back on what he saw. He was the one taking notes in the corner of the room while powerful men decided the fates of cities. For 14 years he stood near power without ever quite holding it, watching how the great ones moved, how they lied, how they kept their word, and how they broke it, how they rose, and how very suddenly they fell. That's an unusual education. Most people who write about power either have it or want it. Machiavelli had spent 14 years standing just to the side of it, close enough to see every crack in the surface, far enough that no one ever bothered to perform for him. He was, in a sense, the assistant in the meeting that everyone forgets is in the room. And the assistant who is forgotten in the room sees everything. Then his world fell apart. Florence at that time was a republic governed by its own citizens, but it had once been ruled by a powerful family, the Medici. And in the year 1512, the Medici came back. They returned to power. The republic that Machiavelli had served for 14 years collapsed underneath him, and a man who had spent his whole career as a loyal servant of that republic suddenly found himself on the wrong side of the new order. He was out, stripped of his position, pushed away from the only work he had ever loved. And then it got worse, much worse. In 1513, the year after the Medici returned, Machiavelli was arrested. He was accused of taking part in a conspiracy against the new rulers, a plot he had nothing to do with. There was no real evidence against him, none. But suspicion was enough in that world to put a man in a cell. And in that cell, they tortured him. I want to tell you how, gently, because it matters for everything that follows and then will breathe, and you can let it go. The torture they used was called the strappado. It was simple and brutal. They tied a man's hands behind his back, then hauled him up off the ground by those same bound wrists, so that all his weight pulled down through his shoulders until the joints wrenched and dislocated. Then sometimes they let him drop and caught him short, so the bones jolted again. It was designed to break the body slowly, to make a man confess to anything. Machiavelli endured it, He was an innocent man, a clerk, a writer, a husband and father, a public servant who had spent 14 years doing his job, and the new powerful people of his city dismissed him as a nobody, accused him of a crime he didn't commit, and dislocated his shoulders to see what would fall out of his mouth. Nothing did, because there was nothing to confess. Eventually, he was released, and the man who walked out of that cell was finished as far as the world was concerned. No job, no standing, just a body that ached, and a name now tangled up in suspicion. So let's pause here for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice the weight of the blankets over you, the simple safety of where you are right now. Warm, unhurt, far away from any cell. And when you're ready, we'll continue together, because this is the exact moment the book was born. Here is what's remarkable. Here is the part that turns a sad story into the deepest lesson of the night. Machiavelli, broken and dismissed, retired to a small farm in the countryside outside Florence. A man who had spent his days among ambassadors and princes now spent them among his fields, his birds, the local men he played cards and argued with at the tavern. By day he was a country nobody. But in the evening he would change. We know this because he wrote about it in a letter to a friend, and the letter is one of the most beautiful things he ever wrote. He said that in the evening he would return home, take off his muddy work clothes and put on the fine robes he had once worn at court. Dressed properly again with dignity, he would step into his study. And there, he wrote, he entered the company of the ancient men, the great writers and rulers of the past. And he asked them questions, and in his imagination they answered him. And for those hours he forgot his troubles. He didn't fear his poverty. He wasn't even afraid of death. He gave himself over entirely to them. Out of those evenings came the book, The Prince. He wrote it in 1513, the very year of the arrest, the torture, the fall. A man who had just been crushed by power sat down and wrote the clearest book about power anyone has ever written. He wasn't a tyrant teaching cruelty. He was a survivor, an exile, an underestimated nobody, trying to understand the forces that had just destroyed his life. He was trying to see clearly, and the strange gift of his situation, the gift of having been thrown all the way down, was that no one was performing for him anymore. He could see the whole machine because he had been crushed by it. Hold on to that, because we'll come back to it. The man who wrote the book on how to read power learned to read it from the bottom, from a prison cell, from a farm he'd been exiled to, from the experience of being so completely underestimated that the people in charge didn't even think he was worth a fair trial. That experience runs underneath every page like an underground river. And it's why his sharpest advice isn't really about how to dominate people. It's about how to survive among people who are trying to dominate you. There's one more small, almost tender detail. When he finished the book, he didn't publish it. In fact, it wouldn't be printed until 1532, 5 years after he was already dead. Instead, he dedicated it, he addressed it as a gift to Lorenzo de' Medici, one of the very family whose return had cost him everything. And the reason is quietly heartbreaking. The dedication was in part a job application. The whole book, this masterpiece, was partly an attempt to prove to the new rulers that he was useful, that he understood power better than anyone, that they should bring him back into service. The exiled servant, aching shoulders and empty pockets, polishing his hard-won wisdom into a gift for the people who had broken him, just for the chance to be allowed back into the room he loved. He never really got back in, but the gift outlived them all. Now let's return to that unfinished sentence, because we've earned it. We've met the man. We know where he learned what he knew. So let's hear the famous line in full, the way he actually wrote it. and watch the cartoon fall away. The line lives in the 17th chapter of The Prince. And the popular version, the one on the posters, says simply, "It is better to be feared than loved, cold, hard," the motto of every office tyrant who ever wanted to sound tough. But here is what Machiavelli actually argued, slowly the way he meant it. He says first that the ideal, the thing you should genuinely aim for, is to be both loved and feared, respected and liked. He doesn't open by telling you to choose, he tells you to want both. Only then does he add the careful condition that because the two are hard to combine, if you are forced to choose between them, if circumstances corner you and you can only keep one, then it is safer to be feared than to be loved. Do you feel how different that is? The cartoon says, pick fear, fear is better, be cold. The real man says, aim for both, always, and only if life forces a brutal choice on you, lean toward respect over affection, because respect is steadier ground than warmth. It's not a celebration of being feared. It's a reluctant, clear-eyed observation about which one holds when everything else gives way. And this maps onto something you felt at work, even if you've never had words for it. Being liked and being respected are not the same thing. They feel similar from the inside, but they behave completely differently out in the world. The person everyone likes is pleasant to be around. They're invited to lunch. People smile when they walk in, but liking is soft. It bends. When the layoffs come, when the hard decision gets made, when someone has to be moved off the project, being liked doesn't protect you because liking lives in people's good moods, and good moods don't survive a budget cut. Respect is different. Respect is the sense that you are capable, that your work holds up, that crossing you would cost something. Respect is leverage. It's the thing that's still standing in the room when the warmth has drained out of it. So if you've ever quietly worried that you're well liked but somehow always overlooked, pleasant included, and yet never quite taken seriously when the real decisions get made, Machiavelli would tell you gently that you've been investing in the softer of the two currencies. Likability is lovely, it's worth having, but it isn't the thing that keeps you safe. And yet, and this is the half of the sentence they cut, the half that's the whole reason we're here tonight, Machiavelli does not stop at be feared. He immediately, urgently adds the rule that matters most of all, the master rule, the one the costume version of him completely erases. He says, above almost everything else, the prince must avoid being hated. Read that again slowly because it changes everything. The man accused of teaching cruelty actually says that the single most dangerous condition you can fall into is not being unloved and not being unfeared, it's being hated. You can be feared without being hated, he explains. The two are not the same. Fear is the sense that you have to be reckoned with. Hatred is the sense that people want you gone. And hatred, he warns, is the soil where every real downfall grows. The feared man is left alone. The hated man gets conspired against. And then he tells you with surprising specificity how to be feared without crossing into being hated. The way to do it, he says, is to keep your hands off two things, people's property and their families. Don't take what is theirs. Don't humiliate the people they love. A leader can be formidable, can be someone you don't dare cross, and still never tip over into being despised, as long as he doesn't reach into people's lives and take the things they hold most dear. Touch a person's livelihood, touch their dignity, touch the people they go home to, and you don't just make an enemy, you make someone who will wait, quietly, for years, for the chance to bring you down. Sit with how decent that actually is underneath its hard surface. The evil handbook's central rule turns out to be, don't take people's stuff, don't shame their families, and don't make yourself the person everyone secretly wants gone. Translate it into the workplace and it's almost gentle. You don't have to be everyone's friend. You don't have to be soft. But never become the colleague the whole floor quietly resents. The one who steals others' credit, who belittles people in front of their peers, who treats the people below him as if they don't matter. Because that person, the hated one, is the one who gets sandbagged, the one whose project mysteriously stalls, the one nobody warns about the meeting. Fear, in Machiavelli's careful sense, costs you nothing and protects you.
Hatred is the thing that quietly destroys you, often from below, often from people you stopped noticing long ago. The way no one noticed the clerk in the corner of the room, taking everything in.
So here is the unquoted line, whole at last, the way he meant it. Aim to be both loved and feared. If you must choose, choose to be respected over being liked, because respect is the steadier ground. But above all of it, beyond either, never, ever let yourself become hated. Don't reach into people's lives and take what's theirs. That is the rule that keeps a person standing in a court 500 years ago or in an open plan office tomorrow morning. And notice who's telling you this. Not a tyrant who learned it by ruling. A man who learned it by being on the receiving end. A man whose own city's new rulers reached into his life and took everything, his work, his standing, the use of his own shoulders, and who walked out of that cell understanding, with terrible clarity, exactly how power decides whom to crush and whom to leave alone. He's not teaching you to be the one who does the crushing. He's teaching you how to not be the one who gets crushed. Let us pause here, just for a breath, before we go any further. Take a slow, deep breath in and let it go, slowly. Notice how the room has gone quiet around you. Notice that there is nothing you need to do with any of this tonight. Nothing to memorize, nothing to apply, no test in the morning. The ideas can simply drift through you like the sound of a voice in another room. If one of them stays with you, good. If none of them do, that's good too. You are allowed to simply rest here in the warm and let the old wisdom keep watch, because we've only just begun. We've heard the first half of the secret, that the line everyone quotes is only the front of a much wiser thought, and that the missing half is the part about never being hated. But Machiavelli has more to show us, much more, and almost none of it is what you'd expect from the man in the black costume on the stage. There's the question of how a person made entirely of force, with no cunning to go with it, walks straight into traps he never sees coming, and the strange creature, half lion and half fox, that Machiavelli says you have to become instead. There's the matter of how the world judges you, not by what you intend in your heart, but by what it can actually see and how things turn out, and what that means for all the quiet, excellent work you do that nobody ever notices. And further on, waiting for us, there's a chapter almost no one ever quotes, that is very nearly a handbook for managing the person you report to, and a darker story still about a man named Ramiro de Orco, and a piazza in a town called Cesena, and the most chilling career lesson ever written down. But all of that is for a little later, when we've settled even deeper. For now, just let this first truth rest in you, soft and whole. The man the world calls a snake spent his sharpest energy telling you how not to be bitten. The most feared book about power was written by someone who had just been broken by it. In the same year, his shoulders were pulled from their sockets by people who thought he was nobody. And the cruelest sounding sentence ever quoted turns out, when you hear all of it, to be a quiet piece of protection. Aim to be respected, yes, but above all, never let yourself become the one they hate. And the man who understood being underestimated better than anyone who ever lived knew something else about it too. Something we haven't touched yet. He knew that being dismissed as nobody Being overlooked, being the forgotten figure in the corner of the room is not only a wound, it can also be a kind of armor. There is a danger in being underestimated and there is a use in it. And the difference between the two is the difference between staying invisible forever and choosing at exactly the right moment to step out of the shadow. He learned both, the danger and the use, the hard way, from the farm and the cell and the long quiet evenings with the company of the ancient dead. And that, the danger and the use of being the one no one sees coming, is exactly where we'll go next. But before we walk into the shadow with him, let us sit a little longer with who he really was, because the cartoon and the man are not the same person, and the gap between them is where almost everyone gets lost. You have heard the word, even if you have never read a page of him, Machiavellian. It arrives in a sentence the way a cold draft arrives under a door. Cunning, cold-blooded, willing to do anything to win. We use it for the co-worker who smiles while sharpening a knife, for the politician we distrust, for anyone who seems to scheme without a conscience. And here is the strange thing about that word, the thing worth resting your mind on tonight. It was never really his. It was put on him after he was already dead by people who mostly had not read him with any care. There was a Frenchman named Innocent Gentillet who in 1576 wrote a long, furious book against him called the Contre Machiavel. It took the most frightening lines, stripped them of everything around them, and held them up as proof that here was a teacher of evil. The book travelled. It crossed into England, and there, on the stages of London, a new kind of villain began to appear. The Machiavel, a grinning, scheming figure who told the audience exactly how wicked he planned to be before he did it. Shakespeare reached for the name. The murderous Machiavel, one of his characters, sneers as if it were a kind of dark magic. And the church had already, in 1559, placed his writings on the index of prohibited books, the list of works the faithful were forbidden to read. So you see what happened. A smear got loose and ran faster than the book it was smearing. The reputation outpaced the text by centuries, and most of us inherited the reputation and never met the text at all. Now let us meet the man underneath it. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli, and he was born in Florence in 1469 and died there in 1527. For 14 years he was no scheming prince and no shadowy advisor. He was a working civil servant, secretary to the Second Chancery of the Florentine Republic, which is a grand-sounding name for an enormous amount of careful, exhausting labor. He wrote letters. He rode out on diplomatic missions. He sat in rooms with kings and popes and warlords and watched very closely how they actually behaved when something they wanted was on the table. He was not powerful. He was the man who served the powerful and studied them while he served. That is a particular vantage, and it teaches a particular kind of sight. And then his world turned over. The Medici family, who had been pushed out, came back to power in Florence, and the republic he had served for all those years collapsed under him. He was, suddenly, on the wrong side of everything. This is the part of his life I most want you to carry into sleep, because it is the seed of everything he understood. In 1513 he was arrested. He was suspected of taking part in a conspiracy against the new Medici rulers, though there was no real evidence that he had. And they tortured him. The instrument was called the strappado, a rope and a pulley, the hands bound behind the back, the body hauled up by the wrists until the weight of a person pulls their own shoulders from their sockets. He endured it. He did not confess to a plot he had not joined, because there was nothing true to confess. And eventually, broken and cleared, he was let go. He did not return to power. He went instead to a small farm outside the city. A man who had spent 14 years at the center of things now spent his days among the ordinary work of the land, walking out to the woods, talking with the men at the local inn, playing cards in the evenings to pass the long, empty hours. He had been at the heart of the Republic, and now he was nobody. Dismissed, set aside, underestimated by everyone who had decided he no longer mattered. And in that same wounded year, on that quiet farm, he wrote the little book that would make the world afraid of his name. He wrote The Prince in 1513. He dedicated it to Lorenzo de' Medici, to one of the very people whose family had just broken him, partly, it seems, in the hope that it might earn him a way back into the work he loved, a way out of the silence of the farm. It was a job application written by a man the world had thrown away. He never saw it published. The Prince did not appear in print until 1532, 5 years after he was already in the ground. Hold that picture for a moment, the way you would hold a warm cup before sleep. The most feared book about power was written by a man who had just lost his own, who had been hauled up by his own arms until his body failed, who was, by every measure the world uses, finished. That is not the hand of a tyrant. That is the hand of a survivor, writing down what he had learned the hardest possible way about how power really moves, so that someone, someday, might not be as defenseless as he had been. And now, gently, let us return to that famous half-sentence and finish it properly, because the fuller thought is even kinder than the first piece we met. In chapter 17, where the line about fear and love lives, his actual reasoning is more careful than the cartoon allows. The ideal, he says, is to be both loved and feared at once. Be both, if you can. Only when you truly cannot hold both, only when life forces the choice, does he say it is safer to lean toward being feared. But even that is not the heart of it. The real rule, the one underneath all of it, is this. Whatever else you do, you must never let yourself be hated. You can be feared without ever being hated, he says, and he tells you exactly how. By not reaching for what is theirs, by not touching people's property and not touching their families. Stay off the things people will never forgive you for, and your firmness becomes something they can live with, instead of something they will spend years quietly waiting to repay. So the lesson, when the whole sentence is finally spoken aloud, is not be cruel. It is closer to this. You do not have to be adored, but you must never become the one they resent. Be respected, be steady, be someone who cannot be casually pushed. And at the very same time, be someone who never makes an enemy out of carelessness, never humiliates, never takes what was not theirs to take. Liked and respected are not the same thing, and of the two, the firmer ground is respect. But hated is the trapdoor under both of them, and the wise person simply learns where it is and steps around it for the rest of their life. Now it is worth sitting with what hated actually produces. Not the sharp dislike that flares up after a hard conversation, and not the cold distance that settles in after a failed project. Those are manageable, those pass. What Machiavelli is pointing to in chapter 17, and then even more carefully in chapter 19, is something slower and quieter than that. He is pointing to the kind of resentment that accumulates without drama, the kind that nobody announces. The colleague who has decided somewhere beneath the surface that your success is a problem. The manager who smiles in every meeting and blocks every opportunity in the ones you are not invited to. The peer who does not oppose you openly because they do not need to. They only need to wait and make sure that when the moment comes, they are not standing next to you. That is what conspiracies born of hatred look like in an organization. Not dramatic betrayal, not speeches, just a steady, quiet withdrawal of goodwill, one small decision at a time, until the day you need someone to speak up for you and discover that nobody in the room is inclined to, In chapter 19, where Machiavelli turns to the question of avoiding contempt and hatred specifically, his core argument is this: the things that most reliably produce conspiracies against a prince are not power or strength or even decisions people disagree with. They are rapacity and irreverence toward property and women, he says, meaning then and meaning now, stripped to its organizational principle. Taking things that are not yours to take. Credit that belongs to a team. Acknowledgement that belonged to a colleague. Resources that were spoken for. The seat at the table someone else built toward over years. The moment an organization's people sense that you are someone who helps yourself to what is not yours, you do not just lose allies, you gain something worse, the quiet, patient attention of people who are now watching to see you fall. You can be demanding without producing that. You can deliver hard feedback without producing that. You can hold people accountable, decline requests, say no to things, advocate firmly for your own work. And none of those things done with care tip you from feared into hated. The tipping point is almost always a form of taking credit, taking space, taking the narrative, taking the last defensible position, and leaving the person across from you with nothing they can hold on to. Machiavelli saw this with the clarity of someone who had watched it at close range for 14 years, who had been inside the room when rulers made these errors and felt the temperature of the room change. He was a careful observer above everything else. And what he observed was that strength and perceived fairness could coexist, not always comfortably and not without cost, but they could coexist. What could not coexist was perceived strength and perceived predation. Once people decided you were the kind of person who took from them, no amount of competence brought back the goodwill. The quietly resented colleague is not avoided because they are weak. They are avoided because they are expensive, because being around them means watching your back, because associating with them, when the room eventually turns, will cost more than the association was ever worth. So the master rule, the one underneath chapter 17's famous line and chapter 19's careful elaboration, is simpler than it sounds and harder than it looks. Do not take what is not yours. Do not humiliate when you could simply correct. Do not make enemies out of carelessness. The person who lives by this rule does not need to be beloved. They need only to be someone other people have no particular reason to want to see fail. Now, with that ground laid, we can look at the chapter Machiavelli put closest to it, because the question that follows naturally, you have learned not to be hated, but what tools do you actually carry into the room, is answered not in chapter 17, but in chapter 18, in one of the most vivid images he ever produced. He says a prince must imitate both the lion and the fox. He must be a lion and a fox at once, or alternately, reading the situation to know which the moment calls for. The fox cannot fight off wolves. Its cleverness will not save it in a direct confrontation with something that simply overwhelms it. The lion cannot see the snares set in the brush. Its strength is of no help when the trap was invisible, laid in advance, and it walked into it before it understood what had happened. Each alone fails. Together they cover each other's weakness. Take a moment with what that pairing actually means in a modern office, not as metaphor, but as mechanism. Pure aggression, being the lion only, is a strategy that works until it encounters a subtler opponent, which it always eventually does. The colleague who comes loudest into every meeting, who takes up the most space, who signals most openly that they will push back on anything that touches their territory. They project force, and that projection matters. Being hard to push around is not nothing. It discourages the casual opportunist, the person who will take credit if it is lying around unclaimed but will not fight for it. Force has social utility, but the person who leads with force and only force has a recognizable vulnerability, and it is this: They can be maneuvered rather than confronted. They cannot see the slower game. The snare is the plan that unfolds across 6 months, the quiet coalition being built behind the scenes, the reframing of their work that happens in the conversations they are not in. You cannot punch a narrative, you cannot intimidate a perception that has already formed. The pure lion in a modern organization is frequently the last to understand what happened to them. Pure cunning, the fox without the lion, is equally incomplete. The person who is all political awareness, who reads every room with precision, who knows exactly where the power flows and navigates it with care, but who has no visible solidity, no backbone, no moment of genuine force or credibility that others have witnessed, is someone the organization can move without consequence. They are clever, but clever is not expensive. If your entire value is your awareness and your flexibility, then you are replaceable the moment someone more flexible and more aware arrives. The fox who cannot fight wolves eventually finds wolves, and the wolves, unlike the snares, are not invisible. They are sitting in your Tuesday morning meeting. What Machiavelli is describing is not a personality type, but a situational fluency. Can you be steady and firm when the moment calls for it, so that people have a real, felt sense that there is weight behind you? And can you also pay attention, track what is actually happening, understand who is aligned with whom, and what the real stakes of a situation are before you move, so that you are never the one who walked into something that was already arranged before you arrived? Most people in organizations default to one or the other. They either come heavy and miss the subtext, or they read the subtext so carefully that they never commit to anything visible and become the kind of person no one quite takes seriously. The Machiavellian workspace skill, stripped of all its theatrical villainous associations, is the capacity to hold both, to know the difference between a moment that calls for the lion and a moment that calls for the fox, to have practiced both enough that neither is a performance. There is a practical starting point for this, and it lives in the second half of chapter 18, in a passage that is even less often quoted than the lion and fox image. Machiavelli writes that a prince must appear, he uses that word specifically, appear, merciful, faithful, humane, religious, and upright. And he must be these things when it is possible. But he must be trained enough in the opposite to know how to change when it is not possible. And then he says something that clarifies everything. He says the reason appearances matter so much is that most people judge by what they see, not by what they can touch. He uses the phrase le mani, hands meaning the few who get close enough to touch to experience you directly, and argues that the many who only observe from a distance, who only see the outcomes, who only hear about you second-hand, they make up the bulk of how you are perceived, and they judge by results and by what they can see, not by your intentions, not by the private reality of your character, by what lands in the room. The phrase he is famous for misquoting is "si guarda al fine," one looks to the end. What it means in context is that rulers are judged by the outcomes they produce, by the ends of their actions rather than the means. The popular compression, the ends justify the means, overstates it and decontextualizes it. He is not saying you may do anything and claim the result excuses it. He is making an observational point about how power is actually evaluated in the world, that people who are watching you, whether in Florence in the 16th century or in a quarterly review in any building anywhere today, form their judgments mostly from what they can see and what came out the other end. Privately, virtuous conduct that produces nothing visible is, in the world's accounting, nearly indistinguishable from no conduct at all. The workplace translation of this is not manipulate appearances or present a false face. It is something more uncomfortable for the people who prefer to believe that good work speaks for itself. It does not always speak for itself. It speaks for itself to the people who were in the room when it happened, who saw the problem it solved, who felt the difference it made. But an organization is not only the people in that room. It is also the people in the other rooms, the people who saw the meeting on the calendar, but not the content, the people who heard about the project but not its details, the people who asked your manager how things were going and got a 2-sentence summary. To all of those people, the visible, what they actually observed or heard, is all there is. And if your visible is thin, their picture of you is thin, and a thin picture of you in the minds of the people who make decisions about your role is a problem entirely separate from how good your actual work is. Managing perception does not mean pretending. It means ensuring that what is real is also seen, that the contribution you made is attached to your name when it is discussed outside the room, that the problem you solved is understood to have been solved, and by you, by the people who matter, that your presence in a conversation is felt as weight, as something that moved the outcome rather than as furniture. This is what si guarda al fine means at the level of an individual career. People will judge you by what they can see of you, and what they can see came out of your work. So be present enough, be visible enough, be connected enough to enough of the right observers that what they see is accurate, not inflated, accurate. The person who is invisible to everyone outside their immediate team has no buffer when their immediate team dissolves. Now here is where the modern research arrives to do something useful. Because Machiavelli was working from observation, from the close study of courts and republics and the long record of what worked and what did not across political history. He was not running experiments, but social psychology spent several decades running the experiments, and some of what they found maps onto what he was describing with a precision that is worth pausing on. The warmth and competence model, developed and elaborated by Susan Fiske, Amy Cuddy, and Peter Glick across research conducted from the 1990s into the 2000s and beyond, describes something consistent and replicable about how people evaluate other people. When we meet someone or think about them, form an impression of them, decide how to treat them, we are doing two things at once, usually without being aware of either. We are asking whether they are warm, whether they seem to have our interests at heart or at least not to be working against them, and we are asking whether they are competent, whether they seem capable of acting on their intentions for good or ill. These are two separate dimensions. They do not move together automatically, and the mapping onto Machiavelli's liked versus respected is direct. Warmth is approximately what he means by loved, by the condition of being liked and approved of by the investment people make in your well-being. Competence is approximately what he means by the respect that comes from being seen as capable and serious and not easily pushed. And the research finding that echoes his argument is this: the two dimensions are real and distinct, and they produce different things. High warmth with low perceived competence produces sympathy, but not influence. High competence with low perceived warmth produces deference under some conditions and resentment under others. The combination that produces actual social and organizational power, the combination that Machiavelli spent an entire chapter trying to describe, is the one that commands both. Not necessarily maximally warm and maximally competent, but genuinely present on both axes, enough that the person forms a complete picture of you rather than a partial one. What makes this research useful rather than merely confirming is the part about the trade-off. Fiske, Cuddy, and Glick found evidence that in many social contexts, people expect warmth and competence to trade off, that seeming very warm makes you seem slightly less competent, and vice versa. This is not a fixed biological law. It is a perceptual tendency, a habit of mind that operates unless something disrupts it. But it means that the intuitive path, seem warm, seem approachable, be likable, may be doing something to the competence perception that you did not intend and cannot see. And it means that the alternative intuitive path, project seriousness, expertise, uncompromising standards, may be quietly accumulating warmth costs without your noticing, until the day you need people to want to advocate for you and discover the room is less warm than you assumed. The practical implication is not to perform both simultaneously in a way that rings false. It is to be deliberate about both, separately, over time. To have moments of genuine competence that are visible, where your judgment called something correctly, where your preparation made the difference, where the thing you knew saved time or prevented damage, and to have moments of genuine warmth that are visible, where you noticed someone was struggling and said so, where you gave credit clearly and in the right room, where you showed that your success does not require someone else's diminishment, not as a performance of the warmth-competence combination, but as an honest expression of both things at the right moments, in front of the right observers. The other piece of modern research that validates the premise, without endorsing the cartoonish version of it, comes from Gerald Ferris and his colleagues, who developed what they called the political skill inventory. The basic finding, replicated across multiple studies, is that what Ferris called political skill, a cluster of capacities including social astuteness, interpersonal influence, apparent sincerity, and network centrality, predicts career advancement and organizational outcomes, and it predicts them independently of raw job performance. Two people with equivalent technical skill and equivalent performance records do not necessarily end up in the same place. The one with higher political skill, meaning in plain language, the one who reads the environment more accurately, builds relationships more deliberately, projects credibility more naturally, and understands how influence moves through the organization, tends to go further. This is not an endorsement of manipulation. The research is careful to distinguish between what Ferris called sincere and authentic political behavior, which predicts good outcomes, and the kind of cynical tactical maneuvering that maps onto the dark triad, which tends to erode trust and eventually backfires. The point is narrower and more useful than either endorsement or condemnation. It is this: being good at the work is necessary but not sufficient. Understanding the environment you are in, knowing who is connected to whom and how decisions actually get made, being seen and perceived accurately by the people who matter. These things are also skills. They are learnable, and they have real effects on where you end up. Ignoring them because they feel uncomfortable or political or somehow beneath the dignity of your actual competence is a choice, just not a neutral one. Machiavelli would have recognized the finding instantly. He spent 14 years watching the Florentine Republic operate at close range, watching which officials rose and which ones were sidelined, watching which diplomatic missions succeeded and which collapsed, watching what actually moved decisions in rooms where decisions were made. And his conclusion, which the political skill inventory is essentially verifying across hundreds of modern workplaces with measurement instruments he never had, was that the map of formal authority and the map of real influence are never exactly the same map. The person who understands only the org chart, who navigates only the stated rules of the structure, is navigating an incomplete picture. And navigating an incomplete picture in an organization where other people are navigating the fuller one is a disadvantage that compounds quietly over time. None of this means you should become someone you are not. None of it means that the person who prefers directness to subtlety, who would rather do excellent work and trust it to be recognized, is wrong about what they value. It means something more specific, that choosing not to understand the environment is different from choosing not to exploit it. You can understand exactly how influence moves through your organization, who the informal authorities are, how information flows, what the real stakes of a given moment are, and use that understanding entirely defensively. Not to maneuver against anyone, not to accumulate power for its own sake, but to protect what is yours, to make sure your work is seen accurately, to know when to speak and when to let things develop, and to never be the last person in the room to understand what is happening. That is the fox, working without the lion as your master. The fox's intelligence turned not toward predation but toward navigation, turned toward the kind of clear-eyed situational awareness that keeps you off the snares and out of the traps that other people, following their own interests with their own degrees of awareness, will have set by no particular malice, only by the ordinary logic of organizations, where resources are limited and positions are competed for, and not everyone who is watching you is doing so with your interests in mind. Chapter 18, in its fullest reading, is asking you to accept that this is the environment you are in. Not because organizations are evil, not because the people around you are uniquely predatory, but because the structure of organized human endeavor, the fact that positions matter, that credit is finite, that recognition does not expand to cover everyone simultaneously, that someone has to decide who gets what, produces these conditions predictably. Machiavelli was not romanticizing them or approving of them. He was simply refusing to pretend they did not exist. And then, having accepted that they exist, he was asking the harder question: given that they exist, what does an intelligent, non-predatory person actually do? Not the person who wants to destroy their colleagues. The person who wants to do good work, hold a position they have earned, and not be eliminated by someone who is playing a game they did not know was being played. That is the person these chapters were written for, underneath all the dramatic framing and all the centuries of misreading. Not the tyrant looking for permission, the capable person looking for a map. And that map, when it is followed through chapter 18 all the way to its conclusion, lands here. Appear what you are, where you can. Be what you appear, where you can. But understand that the world judges by outcomes and visible evidence, not by private intention. So make your private good real enough and visible enough that the distance between what is true and what appears is small. Not zero, it is never zero in any human setting, but small enough that it does not become someone else's opportunity to fill the gap with their own version of you. Because the version of you that exists in rooms you are not in, that impression, that reputation, that half-formed picture built out of second-hand accounts and partial information and the particular perspectives of whoever happened to be in the room when your name came up. That version of you is making decisions with your career that you are not present to contest. And managing that version of you is not dishonest. It is not manipulation. It is the reasonable exercise of care over something that matters and that you have real influence over if you choose to pay attention to it. The warmth and competence model, Machiavelli's lemony, the political skill inventory, the lion and fox image, the careful distinction between fear and hate, they are all pointing at the same underlying fact of organizational life. Other people are forming pictures of you continuously, and those pictures have consequences. The choice is not between managing the picture and refusing to. The choice is between managing it with some awareness and intentionality, or leaving it entirely to chance and the impressions of whoever happened to be watching on whatever day something important was being decided. He chose awareness. 14 years inside the workings of the Florentine Republic, followed by exile, torture, and a farm where he had nothing to do but think, and he chose awareness, not as a path to domination, as a path to survival, as the minimum toolkit for an intelligent person who wants to stay in the game long enough to do something with their presence in it. We will go further into what that toolkit looks like in practice, beginning with the chapter nobody ever quotes when they talk about the prince, the one that is, of everything Machiavelli wrote, most directly useful to the question of how you manage the person above you. Chapter 22 is short, easy to overlook, sandwiched between the bigger, more theatrical lessons about fortune and force. Its title in most translations is something like Concerning the Secretaries of Princes, and because we do not live in principalities and do not have secretaries in the 16th century sense, it tends to get skipped by readers who are moving toward the famous parts. But this is the chapter where Machiavelli essentially describes the entire art of managing up in about 4 paragraphs, and does it more cleanly than most modern management books manage in 200 pages. He opens with a claim that is easy to underestimate. The first judgment of a ruler's intelligence, he says, comes not from anything the ruler has said or written or decided. It comes from the people around him. Look at his ministers. If they are capable and loyal, you may assume the prince is wise because he knew how to recognize them and how to keep them. If they are otherwise, you can form an opinion of the prince because the first mistake he made was choosing them. Sit with that for a moment. He is not talking about the ruler's strategy. He is not talking about the ruler's speech, or bearing, or decisions in the council chamber. He is saying the first thing that tells you about a person in power is the company they have gathered, the selection, the curation. Now turn it around, because that is what he wants you to do. If you are the person being selected, and if you are the minister, the assistant, the direct report, the trusted colleague, then the quality of your work is not evaluated in isolation. It is evaluated as a reflection on the judgment of the person who brought you in. When you succeed visibly and competently, you are not only succeeding, you are confirming that your manager made a smart choice. You are giving them evidence of their own good judgment, which is something most people in positions of authority are quietly hungry for, because the pressure of being responsible for other people's choices is not comfortable, and the reassurance that they chose well is not trivial. This is not flattery. Machiavelli is precise on this. He is not describing a strategy of ingratiation. He is describing a real structural relationship in which your visible competence is genuinely tied to your manager's standing. The connection is real. The implication is simply that you should be aware of it and work with it rather than ignoring it. The minister who understands this, Machiavelli says, will always think of the prince before himself, not out of civility, out of a clear reading of how interests are actually aligned. The minister's best outcome and the ruler's best outcome point in the same direction. Making the ruler look wise for having chosen you is not a sacrifice. It is not subordination. It is the accurate recognition that your own advancement depends in part on theirs, and that this is simply how the structure works. And here, Machiavelli does something that surprises people who expect him to be purely extractive. He turns to the ruler and gives the other half of the equation. If you have a good minister, someone who is genuinely competent, genuinely loyal, genuinely thinking of you before themselves, then your obligation is not to simply receive that gift and move on. You have to keep them. You keep them by honoring them, by enriching them, by sharing credit and including them in decisions, by giving them enough stake in your success that they have no reason to look elsewhere. He is describing, in the 16th century, what behavioral economists and organizational psychologists would spend centuries empirically verifying: that loyalty is not a natural human default. It is a consequence. It is produced by specific conditions, and if you do not produce those conditions, you will not have it, regardless of what you tell yourself about how grateful people should be. The chapter is addressed to the prince, but read from the other side, read from the position of the minister, the subordinate, the person managing someone above them. It contains something equally precise and equally useful. It describes what makes you valuable not as a matter of output alone, but as a matter of alignment. If you can make yourself someone whose success is legible as a confirmation of your manager's judgment, you have created a structural reason for them to protect you and advocate for you that goes beyond simple liking. You have made their investment in you visible to themselves, and visible investments tend to be maintained. Take a slow breath here. We have been moving through ideas fairly steadily, and this one is worth pausing on before we go further. There is a version of what Machiavelli is describing in chapter 22 that sounds cynical, and you may be feeling the edge of it. Making your boss look good as a career strategy. It has a slightly uncomfortable taste, but the discomfort may be coming from the framing, from the assumption that genuine competence and strategic alignment are opposites, that doing the work well and being aware of how it reflects upward are mutually exclusive orientations. They are not. The minister Machiavelli admires is not pretending to be competent. He is competent, and he understands that the visibility and direction of that competence matters. Quiet excellence, as we said earlier, is organizationally indistinguishable from no excellence. Chapter 22 is making the same point from the top down. The ruler who picked you needs to be able to see and claim your quality, or its value to the relationship simply leaks away unaccounted for. There is nothing dishonest in that. There is only attentiveness to how things actually work. Chapter 23 follows almost immediately, and where Chapter 22 is about the people you choose, Chapter 23 is about the particular danger of choosing wrong, of surrounding yourself with people who tell you what you want to hear. Machiavelli calls them flatterers. He says courts are full of them because people are so pleased with their own opinions and so easily deceived in their own judgments that they find it very difficult to defend themselves from this plague. The plague spreads because flattery is comfortable and honesty is often painful, and so powerful people, if they do not actively work against the tendency, will gradually be surrounded by mirrors that only reflect what is pleasing. The person who tells a powerful figure what they want to hear is not useless. They are useful in a specific and narrow way, which is that they reduce friction in the short term, but they are systematically removing the information the powerful person most needs, which is accurate feedback about reality. And over time, the ruler who depends on flatterers goes blind. Not suddenly, gradually. They lose touch with what is actually happening because everyone around them is filtering it. The defense Machiavelli prescribes is specific. A wise ruler selects advisors who are intelligent and who are given explicit, protected permission to speak the truth. But, and this is the part most people skip, only on the things the ruler asks about. The advisor does not volunteer everything. The advisor does not perform bluntness as a personality. The advisor answers honestly when the question is put to them and holds their counsel otherwise. And the ruler, having heard the truth from multiple careful people, decides alone. The model is not radical transparency. It is calibrated candor, honest on demand, discreet by default. Now here is where this becomes directly useful to you from the side of the advisor rather than the ruler. If you are the person trying to be genuinely valuable to someone above you, the thing Machiavelli is describing is not blunt honesty and not flattery. Both fail. The person who volunteers criticism of every decision becomes noise, becomes a problem, gets quietly excluded from the conversations that matter. The person who flatters becomes useless and eventually invisible, furniture that agrees with everything. Neither gets the thing they presumably want, which is influence and trust and a real seat at the table. The person who gets that is the one who has demonstrated over time that when they speak, it is because they have something real to say, and that what they say will be accurate and considered and useful. The person who knows when to stay quiet makes their voice more valuable precisely because it is not constant. The silence signals that when the voice comes, it matters. Fisk and Cuddy, working within the warmth and competence model, found something that maps cleanly onto this. The people rated highest in both dimensions, warm enough to be trusted, competent enough to be relied upon, were not the most vocal or the most assertive. They were the most consistent. The trust came from predictability in the best sense. You knew that what they said matched what was true. Gerald Ferris and the political skill inventory research found something similar at the structural level. The political skill that predicted advancement was not the ability to dominate or to perform. It was the ability to read the environment accurately and to position oneself within it with something like grace. The word Ferris used was sincerity, and he meant it as a technical observation. High political skill involves the ability to seem genuine even in strategic situations, which is most easily accomplished by actually being genuine in most of them and being selective about the ones where strategy enters. Machiavelli would have recognized this completely si guarda al fine. Outcomes are how you are judged. There is a chapter in The Prince that almost no one who quotes Machiavelli has bothered to read. It sits near the back of the book, short and practical and almost businesslike in its tone, and it is the chapter that comes closest to being a direct manual for how to survive inside an organization you do not control. It is chapter 22, titled in most translations something like Concerning the Secretaries of Princes. And the reason it goes unquoted is probably that it does not sound dangerous enough to make a good villain's handbook. There is no cruelty in it. There is no cunning of the Baroque, shadowy kind. It is, at its core, a set of observations about how people who work for someone more powerful than themselves can make themselves indispensable, and how the powerful person, in turn, can recognize and keep someone worth keeping. Machiavelli opens the chapter with a claim that lands hard when you sit with it. He says the first judgment you can make about a ruler's intelligence comes not from the ruler directly, but from the people that ruler has chosen to surround himself with. If the people around a prince are capable and loyal, you can call the prince wise because he had the judgment to choose them and the wisdom to keep them. If the people around a prince are something else, flatterers, incompetents, yes-men, self-promoters, who have never once told their boss an inconvenient truth, then you should adjust your estimate of the prince accordingly, because whatever he believes about his own intelligence, the company he keeps is the evidence that runs the other way. This is, for a workplace, an observation with two sharp edges. The first edge is about the person in the seat of power. The second is about you. From the seat of power's direction, the implication is clear. The quality of your judgment will eventually be read through the quality of the people around you. You cannot hide behind your own self-assessment. The people you choose, the people you keep, the people you promote, and the people you tolerate. These are legible to anyone paying attention. An organization does not judge its leaders only by their stated intentions or their formal credentials.
It judges them by outcomes and by the texture of what they have built. The choosing is visible, but the second edge cuts in the direction of the person who is not the one in the seat. The person who is being chosen or not chosen, the person who is trying to figure out how to position themselves inside a structure they did not design. And here Machiavelli gives something specific.
He says that the test of a good minister, a minister here, means something close to what we would call a senior staff member or a direct report or a trusted lieutenant, is that the minister thinks more about the prince than about himself. The minister whose mind is primarily on his own interests, his own advancement, his own visibility, is a minister who will at some point make a decision that serves those interests at the expense of the person above him, and that once it becomes visible is the beginning of the end. The minister who thinks more about the prince than about himself, who organizes his effort and his attention around making the person above him effective, rather than around showcasing his own brilliance, that minister becomes something the prince cannot easily afford to lose. Not because he has made himself indispensable through any hidden leverage or any accumulated secret knowledge that would be damaging to release, but because the dynamic between them has become genuinely useful to the prince in a way that is hard to replace. The minister is a resource for accurate judgment rather than a source of noise. And Machiavelli is careful to say that this is not a one-directional arrangement. He tells the prince how to keep such a person. You honor him. You enrich him. You share the honors and the burdens with him rather than taking the credit and leaving him the exposure. You make him feel that his fortunes are tied to yours, that there is no position he could reach by undermining you. That would be better than the one he holds by serving you well. The prince who does this has built something stable. The prince who takes his minister's loyalty for granted, who absorbs the credit and ignores the contribution, who treats the people below him as instruments rather than as partners, that prince is manufacturing the conditions for betrayal, and Machiavelli notes this without sentiment. If the minister eventually turns, the prince helped make it happen. In a modern organization, the structure looks different, but the logic is identical. Your manager's reputation is not separate from your work. They are, in many situations, inseparable. When you do something well and visibly, the person who hired you and placed you and advocated for resources to support you, that person also did something well as judged by the organization. The choice was vindicated. The investment paid off. The manager who picked you looks retroactively like someone with good judgment, which is not a small thing in an organization where credibility is a currency. This means that genuinely excellent work done visibly in a way your manager can point to is not simply a contribution to the organization. It is also a contribution to the specific person whose reputation is bound to your placement. Machiavelli would say, "You are thinking about the prince." The modern framing would be something less martial. You are thinking about the shared investment. But the dynamic is the same, and the outcome is the same. You become expensive to lose, not because you have made yourself dangerous to remove, but because removing you costs the person above you something real. There is a version of this that sounds cynical and a version that is simply accurate. The cynical version treats it as a performance. Do just enough to be visible. Calibrate every contribution to its political effect. Think of your manager's reputation purely as an instrument for your own advancement. Machiavelli did not teach that, and it does not work anyway, because people who are primarily performing are eventually legible as performers, and a performer is not the same as someone who thinks more about the prince than about himself. The simply accurate version is that good work and organizational awareness are not opposites. You can be genuinely committed to the work and simultaneously aware that how the work is perceived, and by whom, and whether it is actually associated with your name and your contribution, are things that matter. Quiet excellence that no one sees is, organizationally, indistinguishable from no excellence. Machiavelli did not invent this observation. He simply stated it plainly in chapter 18 and moved on. Making your boss look smart does not require flattery. It does not require suppressing your own ideas or subordinating your judgment. It requires that you do your job well, that the doing is visible in the right directions, and that when you make your boss look good, it is because you actually made good decisions, not because you told them what they wanted to hear, and then stood aside while the real problem accumulated. Which brings us directly to chapter 23. If chapter 22 is about the minister making the prince effective, chapter 23 is about the single greatest obstacle to that happening. Machiavelli calls the chapter something like How Flatterers Should Be Avoided. And the reason it matters for the modern workplace is that it is not actually a chapter about flatterers in the way you might expect. It is not primarily a warning to the person with power that some of the people around them are insincere. That is a secondary observation. The primary observation is more uncomfortable. He begins by saying that courts are full of flatterers. He means this not as a character judgment about the people doing the flattering, but as a structural observation about the environment. When you are in a position of power, the conditions you create tend to produce flattery whether you want them to or not. People read the incentive structure. They see what gets rewarded and what gets punished. If speaking the truth when it is inconvenient tends to produce bad outcomes for the speaker, then over time, the people who remain close to you will be the ones who have learned to say what produces good outcomes. The selection happens gradually and without anyone consciously orchestrating it. The honest ones get edged out or stop speaking. The accommodating ones move in. And then the prince looks around his court and finds that it is full of people who tell him things he likes to hear, and he believes this is because things are going well. Machiavelli's proposed solution is specific and worth examining carefully. He says a prince protects himself from this by selecting wise advisors and granting them the freedom to speak the truth, but only on matters the prince asks about. Not on anything they feel like raising, not in any format they choose, not at any moment they judge appropriate, on the matters the prince asks about. He should reward honesty on those matters and be seen to reward it, so that people learn that the incentive structure runs the other way from the normal one. But the asking is the prince's prerogative. The honest counsellor speaks when asked, not whenever the mood takes him. And then Machiavelli says something that is easy to miss because it arrives so quickly. He says that the prince who is not wise himself cannot be well advised, because good advisers will give him different counsel on different questions, and without the wisdom to weigh and synthesize those different views, he will simply be pulled in whatever direction the last person spoke. Good advice depends on the prudence of the prince. It does not generate that prudence. You cannot outsource judgment to advisors and expect to remain effective. The advisors are an input. The decision is yours. The workplace translation of this is about positioning rather than management. It is about understanding what role you can usefully play in the structure above you and what that requires of you. There is a particular skill that becomes extremely valuable in most organizations, and it is not the skill of telling your manager uncomfortable truths in unstructured ways whenever you happen to perceive them. That is not a skill. That is an impulse dressed as virtue. The actual skill is what the research dossier describes as calibrated candor, being the person who tells the truth when asked, who is reliably honest in the moments when honesty is sought, and who is otherwise quiet in a particular way, not passive, not uninformed, not disengaged, but deliberately not filling available space with noise. The person who comments on everything trains the people around them to apply a discount rate to what they say. There is too much of it. Some of it is bound to be wrong. Some of it is clearly not thought through. The commentary becomes ambient rather than signal. The person who speaks rarely and whose words, when they come, are measured and accurate and useful, has not made themselves less influential by the silence. They have made themselves more influential because the signal-to-noise ratio is entirely different. What they say lands differently. This is what Machiavelli means by the freedom to speak the truth only on matters asked about. He is not counselling passivity or sycophancy, he is counselling selectivity. The honest counsellor speaks when the channel is open and the question is genuine. He does not broadcast honesty into the void and expect it to be received as wisdom rather than as noise or threat. For the person trying to read those above them, chapter 23 has another layer. Courts are full of flatterers, Machiavelli says. Organizations are full of people who have learned to tell the person in power what that person wants to hear. This is a description of the environment you are operating in. It is not a description of what you should do. It is a description of what most people around you are already doing, which means two things simultaneously. The first is that the person above you is, in all likelihood, receiving a distorted picture of reality, unless they have unusually strong structural defenses against this. Not because anyone is consciously lying necessarily, but because the incentive structure selects for accommodation, and people accommodate without always realizing they are doing it. The powerful person tends to have a somewhat inflated picture of how things are going, a somewhat softened sense of the real difficulties, a somewhat skewed impression of which problems are manageable and which are not. The second is that the person who does not do this, who is genuinely structurally different from the ambient flattery in a way that is visible and consistent, occupies a specific position that has no competition. There is always demand for the honest voice. There is never a shortage of accommodating ones. The person who has built a reputation for accuracy, for saying difficult things when asked and being right about them, is occupying a position in the market for counsel that most people have vacated by trying to be liked. But the precision matters. Machiavelli is not saying, be the person who challenges everything and performs difficult truths loudly. That is not calibrated candor, that is theatre. The honest person who performs their honesty becomes, over time, identifiable as a performer, and the performance undermines the content. The useful version is the person whose honesty is structural rather than theatrical. It is how they actually operate, which means it is there when it is needed and absent when it is not needed, and the absence is as legible as the presence. Silence, for this person, carries meaning. When they do not speak, it is not because they have nothing to say. It is because nothing has yet risen to the level that requires saying. And when something does, they say it. Cultivate a couple of honest peers who will tell you how you are actually perceived. Machiavelli's observation cuts in the direction of the powerful, but the mechanism works at every level. You are also susceptible to the inflated picture. You also have people around you who have learned to accommodate, who will affirm your decisions and your self-assessments and your interpretations of events, because accommodation is the low-friction path. The person who can find one or two people in the organization who will tell them the truth about how their presentation landed, about what the senior person actually thought, about what the meeting was really about, is operating with better information than almost everyone else. That is an advantage that compounds. Now, there is a piece of this story about reading power and navigating above you that Machiavelli did not teach from a theory. He taught it from the specific position of someone who had been systematically underestimated, dismissed, removed, and in the most literal possible sense, tortured into irrelevance, and who used every bit of that vantage point to understand how power actually works. When the Medici returned to Florence in 1512, Machiavelli lost everything he had built over 14 years. The second chancery, the diplomatic work, the accumulated knowledge of how Italian politics moved and what its actors actually wanted as opposed to what they said they wanted. All of it dissolved. He was removed. Then, in 1513, he was arrested on suspicion of conspiracy. There was no real evidence. It did not matter. He was imprisoned and subjected to the strappado, a form of torture in which the victim's hands are bound behind the back and they are hoisted by a rope attached to those hands, then dropped, stopping short of the ground. The shoulders dislocate. It was used to extract confessions. He confessed to nothing because there was nothing to confess, but that distinction was largely irrelevant to the mechanics of power at that moment. He survived. He was released. He retired to his farm at Sant'Andrea in Cesena, a few miles south of Florence, broke and effectively erased. He was nobody. He had been made nobody. And this is where the observation about underestimation becomes useful rather than simply tragic. From the position of nobody, you see things that the somebody cannot see. When you are not a threat, people are less careful around you. When you are not in contention for anything, the performances that people put on for those who are in contention relax. You are on the outside of the thing, which means you have a view of its shape that those on the inside do not have because they are too close to see it as a shape at all. They can only see the immediate environment, the immediate pressure, the immediate competition. Machiavelli sat on his farm and wrote. The prince took shape in 1513 while the humiliation was fresh. The Discourses on Livy followed, assembled over the next several years. What he produced was not the work of someone who had been destroyed by the experience. It was the work of someone who had been freed by it into a kind of clarity that power, when you are inside it, makes almost impossible. The vantage point of the dismissed, the exiled, the underestimated, it turns out to be one of the best places from which to understand the architecture of the thing that dismissed and exiled and underestimated you. In a workplace, this principle operates at a scale that is less dramatic but structurally similar. Being underestimated, being in the room without being the center of it, being on the project without being the most visible person on it, being present in the conversation without being the one everyone is watching, creates room to maneuver in ways that being fully visible does not. You can observe without performing. You can take in what is actually happening rather than managing what people think is happening. You can build quietly without every move being analyzed by people who see you as competition. There is a specific kind of knowledge that accumulates from this position. The person who is underestimated gets to hear things the recognized person does not hear because people do not yet know they need to be careful around them. The person who is underestimated gets to see how the room actually operates before they are factored into the room's political calculations. The person who is underestimated can experiment and fail and learn without each failure being scored against them in the official record, because nobody is keeping the official record yet. These are real advantages. Machiavelli would have recognized every one of them. He spent the years of his exile using them, turning the position of irrelevance into one of the most complete observations of power ever written. The underestimation was the condition that made the work possible. But there is the other side, and it matters enough to state plainly. Being underestimated is useful for a period, and then it becomes a trap. The shelf life is not indefinite. The advantages of operating below the radar, room to maneuver, room to observe, room to accumulate without being tracked. All of those advantages are contingent on the position being temporary. If the position becomes permanent, if you stay underestimated past the point where the invisibility serves you, then you have not used the position to build something. You have simply remained invisible. And invisible, after a certain point, means absent. The organization, the manager, the colleagues who might have advocated for you, they cannot advocate for what they cannot see. The contribution that is never surfaced is, in practical terms, a contribution that was never made. Machiavelli himself understood this. The prince was dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici partly as a job application. The man who had spent years accumulating extraordinary insight into how power worked was trying to re-enter the structure that had ejected him. He was not content to remain on the farm forever, however productive the exile had been. The insight was meant to return him to the place where the insight could be applied. He sent the book. He was not recalled. He died in 1527, still largely on the outside. The lesson is not that the effort was worthless. The lesson is that the decision about when to make yourself visible, when to surface the accumulation and say, "This is what I have built and this is what I can do," that decision is as important as the building itself. Staying underestimated too long is its own failure mode. It is the fox without the lion. The pattern recognition with no force behind it, no visibility, no capacity to hold the position once the position is within reach. There is a moment in the trajectory of every person navigating a complex organization where the tools that protected them in one phase become liabilities in the next. The quietness that made them trustworthy becomes an absence that makes them forgettable. The calibrated holding back that made their voice valuable becomes a silence that the organization eventually fills with someone else. Recognizing when that transition is approaching, when the protection of being underestimated has been fully extracted and it is time to become visible, is one of the most important readings a person can make about their own position. And then there is the question of whose estimation you are building into as you become visible. Chapter 9 of The Prince is titled something like Concerning a Civil Principality, and it contains a structural insight about how power is acquired and what that acquisition is built on, an insight that maps with unusual precision onto the question of how careers are built inside organizations. Machiavelli distinguishes between two routes to power. The first is rising through the favor of the great, the nobles, the powerful, the established interests who have resources and connections and who might choose to sponsor your ascent. The second is rising through the favor of the people, the broad base, the rank and file, the colleagues and peers who collectively constitute the organization's main body rather than its apex. His preference is clear and his reasoning is specific. The great, Machiavelli says, see you as their equal. They helped you rise, which means they believe they have a claim on you, and they believe that their claim makes you, in some sense, their instrument. When you have the seat they helped you reach, They expect to be able to use that seat for their purposes. They see themselves not as your supporters, but as your principals, the people whose interests you now serve in exchange for the favor they extended, and because they see themselves as your equal, or if they are being honest, as your superior in the ways that actually matter. They will not settle for being junior partners in an arrangement they believe they should control. The great are satisfied with almost nothing. Whatever you give them, they believe they are owed more. The people ask only one thing. They ask not to be oppressed. They do not want to be wronged or ignored or used against their own interests. They do not expect to direct you or command you or receive payment on an implied debt. They want to be treated decently and to trust that the person who rose among them remembers what it was like to be where they are. This is a far more manageable expectation. Meeting it does not require giving anything away, only refraining from taking what is not yours. The practical consequence of this distinction is about durability. A position built on the favor of a few powerful sponsors is fragile in two specific ways. The first is that each of those sponsors privately calculates whether you are still useful to them, whether the arrangement still serves their interests, whether the moment has come to withdraw the favor and apply it somewhere else or against you specifically. You are always one recalculation away from losing the support that made the position possible. The second is that the powerful sponsors who helped you see you as their instrument, which means they also see you as competition. You have risen, which means you now occupy space they might otherwise have occupied or controlled. And the people who see you as competition will, at some point, behave competitively. A reputation built broadly across the organization, across the peer group, across the many people who notice how you work and how you treat people, and what your judgment is like over time, that is built on a different foundation. It does not depend on any single person's continued goodwill. It cannot be destroyed by one sponsor's decision to withdraw. When the reorganization comes, when the sponsor is moved or removed or decides their interests have changed, the person with a broad base still has a base. The person whose position depended entirely on that sponsor has whatever the sponsor leaves behind, which is often very little. This is not an argument against mentors or sponsors or powerful allies. Machiavelli is not saying avoid the great, refuse their patronage, build only from the bottom. He is saying that patronage from the great is useful as a supplement to a broader foundation and catastrophic as a substitute for one. The person who builds both, who is trusted by the people they work alongside and also has the backing of one or two people in positions of power, is in the strongest position. The person who has only the latter is in a position that looks strong and feels precarious, because every piece of it depends on someone else's continued calculation that the arrangement serves them. There is also a subtler point embedded in the distinction Machiavelli draws. The great, who see you as their equal and therefore as competition, are motivated to prevent your further rise in ways that the people, who only ask not to be oppressed, are not. When you become highly visible as the protégé of a powerful person, you also become visible as a potential rival to others in that person's orbit. The network you have entered through one patron is a network of people who are all, to varying degrees, in competition with each other, and your arrival in it does not make that competition friendlier. You have entered a field that was already contested. When you build a reputation broadly among peers, the political math is different. Peers generally benefit from your competence rather than being threatened by it, at least in the early stages. A colleague who is good at their work makes the team better and makes the shared projects more likely to succeed, and most people in most organizations know this. The competition among peers becomes meaningful only when you are directly contesting for the same specific position, and even then, it is a competition with rules and transparency that the competition among powerful sponsors and their protégés does not have. Machiavelli's argument, stripped of its 16th century political dress, is about the distribution of risk, concentrating all of your organizational safety in one powerful relationship is a high-variance strategy. Distributing it across a broad reputation is lower variance and, over time, more resilient. The river floods unpredictably. You build dikes before it floods, not after. The dike here is the relationship you have with the wider organization, not manufactured, not performed, not politically calculated in the moment, but built over time by working well and being seen to work well by people at every level of the thing you are inside. This is, among other things, why the advice from Chapter 22 about making your boss look smart is not a ceiling. Making your direct manager look good is one piece of the foundation. It is not the whole foundation. The person who is known only to their manager, whose reputation exists only in that single vertical relationship, has built exactly the kind of single patron dependency that Machiavelli warns against. The robustness comes from being known across the horizontal too, by colleagues in other groups, by people in adjacent functions, by the people below you who notice whether you treat them with any degree of decency, by the people above your manager who occasionally have a view of what is happening. None of this requires performing. None of it requires managing yourself as a brand in the way that contemporary career advice tends to frame it, as if the primary activity were the image rather than the substance. Machiavelli's entire framework assumes that the substance is real. The performances, the appearances, the perception management, those are the adjustments you make on top of real competence and real contribution. The person who tries to build a broad reputation without the substance underneath it is doing exactly what Machiavelli warned against, relying on fortune rather than virtue, on appearance rather than arm, and they will find, when the circumstances change, that there is nothing underneath the appearance to hold the position. The river floods, there are no dikes, the position washes away. The fox needs the lion. The perception needs the reality beneath it. The silence that makes your voice valuable needs the knowledge and judgment underneath the silence to justify it. The calibrated candor needs to actually be accurate when it speaks. The minister who thinks more about the prince than about himself needs to actually be the person who makes the prince effective, not someone performing that role for strategic effect. One of the things that makes Machiavelli unexpectedly useful for a workplace as opposed to a throne room or a battlefield is that the scale of the thing forces an honesty that grand political strategy can sometimes disguise. At the level of a career in an organization, you cannot maintain a fiction for very long. The people around you see you work. They are in the room. They know whether your contributions are real. They know whether your honesty is genuine or theatrical. They know over time whether you are the person who thinks about the shared work or the person who is primarily managing their own position. The scale is intimate enough that the performance is legible. Machiavelli's advice, when it is read carefully rather than cherry-picked for the dramatic lines, assumes a person who is operating at full capacity, who is genuinely competent, genuinely honest in the ways that matter, genuinely building something real, and is trying to understand how to navigate the political environment around that genuine core without being destroyed by it. The defensive posture is the correct one, not because aggression is morally wrong, though it may be, but because aggression in a workplace at the scale of most careers is not the problem people face. The problem is surviving among people who are sometimes indifferent, sometimes careless, sometimes self-interested, sometimes genuinely competitive, and occasionally actively destructive. And doing so without becoming any of those things yourself, and without being naive enough to pretend that any of those things are not present. That is the environment Chapter 9 and Chapter 22. And Chapter 23 are all navigating, not the conquest of a territory, not the seizure of a throne, but the quieter, longer-running question of how to remain effective and whole inside a structure you did not design, among people you did not choose, in conditions that will change in ways you cannot fully predict. The river floods, you build the dikes you can, you read the room. You choose, as carefully as you can manage, who is worth depending on and to what degree. You make the person above you look wise for having picked you. You tell the truth when asked. You stay quiet when the silence is more useful than the noise. You build your reputation across the whole base, not just up the single line that leads to one powerful person. You remember what Machiavelli himself forgot too late or never had the fortune to apply, that the underestimation that gave you clarity is useful for exactly as long as you use it, and the moment comes when you have to step back into the light and let the work be seen. And then there is Ramiro de Orco. It is worth sitting with the story for a moment, because Machiavelli tells it in chapter 7 with a kind of admiration that still has the power to make you stop and stare. Cesare Borgia had been given the Romagna, a region of central Italy, rough, factional, resistant to order, the kind of territory where loyalty was a concept people used when it suited them and abandoned without ceremony when it did not. Borgia needed to pacify it. He needed someone who could go in hard, hold nothing back, make the necessary cruelties quick and comprehensive, and he found his man in Ramiro de Orco. Ramiro was cruel, efficient, and apparently very good at what he did. He went into the Romagna and he did the work. The region was brought to order. The factions were suppressed. What had been ungovernable became, by most visible measures, governed. And the region hated him for it. Not Borgia, Ramiro. The man who had done the work with his hands, who had been the face of every harsh decision, who had delivered every punishment. It was his name that collected the resentment. Borgia sat at a remove, the authority behind the cruelty, but not the cruelty itself. And then, once the Romagna was subdued and Ramiro had served his function, Borgia had him arrested. And one morning the people of Cesena came out into the piazza and found Ramiro de Orco displayed there, cut in two, a piece of wood, and a bloody knife beside him. Machiavelli writes that the people were satisfied and stupefied. They got what they wanted, in a sense. The man they had been told to fear and hate was gone, punished, made nothing. And Borgia got what he wanted. He had used Ramiro to absorb every grain of resentment the pacification had produced. And then he discarded him publicly, dramatically, in a way that said clearly to anyone watching, I too found him excessive. I too have taken care of the problem. Machiavelli presents this as a strategic masterpiece, and within its own frame it is. But for the person reading this from somewhere in a modern building, sitting in a chair, thinking about their own workplace, the lesson is almost perfectly inverted. Because you are almost certainly not Borgia, you are almost certainly Ramiro. Or rather, you are the person who could become Ramiro. If you are not paying attention, if you are not reading the structure of the situation, you are being handed. The person who gets asked to be the enforcer, the one who gets told, we need someone who can go in and make the hard calls. We need someone who can deliver the difficult news. We need someone who can do the thing that needs doing, and you are the person we trust to do it. And this sounds, when it is delivered, like recognition. It sounds like confidence. It sounds like you have been selected for your capabilities. But before you step into that role, you need to ask one question that Machiavelli is essentially screaming from chapter 7, though he phrases it as admiration for Borgia rather than warning for Ramiro. The question is this: when this is over, who holds the resentment? Because in Borgia's structure, the answer was always Ramiro from the beginning. Before Ramiro did a single thing, the architecture was designed so that the resentment would accumulate on him and the credit would remain with Borgia. Ramiro was a vessel for odium, not a partner in a project. He was useful for exactly as long as the work required a face to receive the hatred And then he became the cleanest possible sacrifice, the one whose removal let Borgia look simultaneously effective and just. The people who get handed the hatchet man role in modern organizations are not usually being set up with quite this degree of premeditation. Most managers are not strategists at this level of deliberateness, but the structure still operates. Whoever delivers the cuts absorbs the resentment for the cuts, regardless of who made the decision. Whoever sends the difficult emails, whoever has the difficult conversations, whoever announces the things nobody wanted announced, that is the face the resentment finds. And if the person behind them has been careful about their own visibility in those decisions, the Ramiro structure has been reproduced, whether anyone intended it or not. Machiavelli's guidance for the person reading this is not be Borgia. The guidance, if you flip the story to where the actual risk lives for a person of ordinary ambition in a regular workplace, is, before you accept the role of enforcer, make sure you know whether the structure is designed to deposit the resentment on you permanently, or whether you will be standing beside the person who gave the order when the dust settles. Because if the person who gave the order will be invisible when it is time for credit and visible when it is time for accountability, you are not a trusted deputy, you are a lightning rod, and the lightning rod is used for exactly one thing. There is a related question about credit itself, which is quieter and more everyday, and in many ways more important for how most careers actually run. The Ramiro story is the dramatic extreme, but the ordinary version of the same structure is simply this: who is in the room when the success is named? Machiavelli's instinct in chapter 18 on appearances and outcomes, and in chapter 22 on the secretary and the prince, is that credit is a function of visibility. The person who built the thing and the person who is seen to have built the thing are not always the same person. And organizations tend to remember the person who was seen. This is not an injustice unique to politics in Renaissance Italy. It is a description of how human attention and memory actually operate. People cannot hold detailed causal chains in mind indefinitely. What they hold is the image of who was present, who was credited, who said the thing in the meeting that landed well, whose name was attached to the project in the documentation. The work of protecting your credit is therefore not the work of claiming things you did not do, and it is not the work of making other people look smaller than they are. It is the simpler, more honest work of making sure that your genuine contributions are visible, that your name is on the things you built, that when the success is recounted, you are not the person who did the work in a back room and handed it to someone else to present. The quiet excellence that nobody sees is, in organizational terms, nearly indistinguishable from no excellence. Machiavelli would have understood this immediately. He spent 14 years doing some of the most sophisticated political and diplomatic work in Florence, and when the Medici came back, it evaporated. He had no visible foundation. He had been a servant of the Republic, and the Republic was gone, and nobody with the new power had any reason to remember what he had built. The timing question is its own tool. In chapter 3, in the middle of an argument about how new territories should be handled, Machiavelli drops something that has almost nothing to do with territorial acquisition and almost everything to do with how human beings process information over time. Injuries, he says, by which he means harsh actions, difficult changes, things that hurt, should be done all together, quickly in one batch, so that they are felt less because they are tasted for a shorter time. Benefits, meanwhile, should be given out little by little, distributed over time, so that they are savored more because they arrive repeatedly. The logic is almost physiological. When you experience a series of sharp, negative things in quick succession, they compress in memory. The suffering was real, but it ends, and the ending is a relief, and the relief attaches to the person who delivered the ending. When you experience a series of positive things spread over time, you get the pleasure of each individual arrival. Every new good thing is its own moment of goodness. and the person who delivers them remains each time the person associated with the positive feeling. Translated into a workplace, the principle is precise and applicable. If you have bad news to deliver, restructuring, reductions, policy changes that nobody wanted, compress it. Deliver it all. Do not bleed it out in small installments, because every installment reopens the wound and keeps you associated with the pain. One complete, honest accounting, delivered clearly, and then done with, lets the whole room absorb it, process it, and eventually move past it. The manager who reveals cuts one at a time over 3 months gets resented for 3 months. The manager who reveals them all at once, with as full an explanation as the situation allows, absorbs a sharper initial hit, and then, typically, gets the room to a functional state faster. And if you have wins to share, contributions to report, projects that came out well, improvements that landed, spread them out. Do not announce everything at once in a single memo that gets read once and filed. A good outcome communicated this week, a recognition shared next week, a result mentioned at the meeting 2 weeks after that. These land as a series of distinct moments, each one a small deposit in the account. You are not amplifying the wins. You are simply giving each one the air it needs to actually register. This is not manipulation. It is paying attention to how information actually lands in human minds, which are not spreadsheets that process all inputs equally regardless of timing. Machiavelli understood this because he watched rulers succeed and fail in real time, and he noticed which structural patterns tended to produce which outcomes, regardless of how virtuous or vicious the person executing them happened to be. And that word, virtù, brings us to one of the more genuinely interesting arguments in the entire book. Machiavelli uses virtù to mean something that has almost nothing to do with virtue in the conventional moral sense. He means something closer to capability, to skillful initiative, to the capacity to read a situation and act effectively within it. The opposite of virtù is not vice. The opposite is passivity, waiting, depending on circumstances to arrange themselves in your favor. Fortuna is his word for the circumstance here. We see fortune, the river, the tide of events that runs through any career and carries some people and destroys others, not according to who deserved what, but according to who was prepared. In chapter 6, he distinguishes between those who rise by their own arm and their own capacity, their own preparation, their own built resources, and those who rise by fortune alone. The person who rises by fortune alone, he says, rises easily and falls easily because they have no independent foundation. When the fortune that elevated them shifts, there is nothing underneath. No skill, no established reputation, no set of relationships and demonstrated capabilities to stand on. They were up because a current picked them up, and when the current moved, they had nothing. The person who builds by virtù, by their own effort and skill and deliberate preparation, may have a harder time getting started. Machiavelli names Moses and others who had to fight for everything, who faced resistance precisely because they were building something real, and real things attract real opposition. But what they built endured because it was anchored in something they had constructed, not something they had been handed. Chapter 25 is where he extends this into his most famous image. Fortune, he says, is like a flooding river. When it rises and overflows, it drowns everything in its path, moves the earth, sweeps trees away, destroys everything. And there is no human way to resist it when it is in full flood. But he goes on, in calm times, people can prepare. They can build dikes, they can construct channels, they can do the work in ordinary time that gives the river somewhere to go when it rises and limits how much destruction it can do. And then he makes the move that gives the whole image its weight. Fortune governs roughly half of all our actions, he says, and leaves the other half to us. Roughly half. That is the number Machiavelli believed in, watching Renaissance Italy from the position of a man who had been inside power, had survived its collapse, had survived torture and exile and dismissal, and who had thought about its mechanics with more sustained attention than almost anyone before or since. Half, not a quarter, which would be despair. If only a small fraction of what happens to you is within your reach, what is the point of trying? Not 3/4, which would be an optimistic fantasy with no accounting for the actual chaos of events. Half. Enough to matter enormously. Enough to mean that how you use it defines a great deal of what happens. But not so much that good preparation is a guarantee or that bad luck cannot reach you even when you have done everything right. The dikes you build before the flood, in a career, in a real organization, are things like a documented track record, contributions recorded in writing, relationships built across the organization rather than consolidated in one direction, skills developed before they are urgently needed, a reputation established over time for specific things rather than vague general impressions. These are the dikes. They do not stop the flood. When the reorganization comes, when the leadership changes, when the budget is cut and positions are eliminated, none of these preparations guarantee you, but they give you structure that survives the current. They give the river somewhere to go that is not directly through you. The person who has built no dikes, who has depended entirely on fortune, on the favor of one powerful patron, on being in the right place at the right time, on the assumption that the current situation will simply continue, that person has left the full half that is their own responsibility completely untended. And when the river rises, which it will because it always does, they find they have nothing underneath. This is not pessimism. This is the structure Machiavelli saw clearly and repeatedly across the careers of rulers and subordinates and ministers and advisors across Italy in the most turbulent decades of Renaissance politics. The river floods. Prepare the dikes you can in the time you have, while the water is still low. And now the ethical line, because everything up to this point has been practical, strategic, anchored in the text and in observation. But there is a line, and Machiavelli actually knew where it was, and it matters for how you use any of this. In 1970, two researchers named Richard Christie and Florence Geiss published a book called Studies in Machiavellianism. They had spent years trying to measure the degree to which people adopted what they identified as a Machiavellian orientation toward other human beings. Instrumental, cynical, detached, willing to manipulate as a practical tool. They developed a scale for it, called the Machiavelli, drawn loosely from the writings but formalized as a psychological construct. High scorers on the Mach 4 tend to see other people primarily as resources to be managed, to feel comfortable with manipulation as a normal social strategy, and to be relatively untroubled by moral consideration when calculating how to achieve their goals. This construct, the psychological Machiavellianism of Christie and Geiss, became one of the three elements of what later researchers would call the dark triad: Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. Three patterns of personality that overlap in their disregard for other people's interests and their willingness to use people instrumentally. And here is what the research on this construct consistently finds. In the short term, high Mach individuals can be effective manipulators. They read situations well, they are less inhibited by social discomfort or guilt. They are willing to do things that lower Mach people hesitate to do. In narrow windows, in specific games, they can win more than they should. But across time, across relationships, across careers that run longer than a few years, in any single place, the outcome is different. Manipulation burns trust, and trust in organizations is the substance that makes everything else function. The person who is eventually identified as someone who uses people, who takes credit, who deflects blame, who says different things to different people, who treats relationships as assets, to exploit rather than connections to sustain, that person becomes progressively more isolated. Not from dramatic confrontation usually, just from the slow, ordinary drift of other people deciding one by one that they do not particularly want to include them, support them, share useful information with them, or go to any trouble on their behalf. The network decays. The information stops flowing. When the river rises, nobody moves to help. And the person who was skilled at manipulation discovers that they have confused short-term maneuver for long-term foundation, and that those are not the same thing. Machiavelli himself, the actual historical man writing in his actual historical context about actual rulers wielding actual state power, was not writing a self-help guide for middle management. But the lesson maps precisely, and it maps in a direction that is almost the opposite of what the word Machiavellian is popularly taken to mean. Because reading power is not the same as manipulating people. Recognizing how credit and blame move is not the same as engineering situations to leave others with the blame. Understanding when to speak and when to stay silent is not the same as deceiving. Knowing what your superior actually needs and making yourself valuable to that need is not the same as flattery. The dark triad construct is the trait the word warns you about. The thing Machiavelli was actually doing in the chapters that matter is something different. It is observation. It is pattern recognition. It is the deliberate refusal to be naive about how organizations actually function, paired with the equally deliberate refusal to let that realism tip you into the thing it describes. Seeing the snake clearly is not the same as becoming one. And in fact, the clearest readers of power, in the people who understand precisely how manipulation operates, who knows which moves are being made and why, are often the last people likely to deploy manipulation carelessly because they have the clearest view of what it costs. There is one more thing, it is the most important thing, and it is the one that probably surprises people most, even after everything else. Niccolo Machiavelli, the man whose name became synonymous with cynical one-man scheming, with the ruthless concentration of power in a single person's hands, with the ends justify the means and manipulation and the destruction of political opponents. This man, in his other major work, the Discourses on Livy, written around 1517, argued plainly and at length that republics are better than princes, not as a reluctant concession, not as a minor footnote, as a central argument of the longer book, the one he himself thought was his more important work. He argued that broadly shared power, the kind that includes civic participation, legal structures, checks and balances, the capacity for citizens to be heard, produces more durable and more resilient states than any form of one-man rule. He argued that liberty, real political liberty, makes people stronger, more invested, more creative, more willing to defend the thing they have a stake in. He argued that law was more reliable than the will of any individual, however virtuous. Quentin Skinner and the scholars associated with what has come to be called the Cambridge School of Intellectual History have spent decades making this argument in detailed academic terms, that Machiavelli is better understood as a theorist of republican civic virtue than as a coach for princes, that The Prince, the short, furious, unflinching book he wrote in 1513, is better read as a survival guide for a specific emergency than as his comprehensive view of how human society should be organized. He was exiled. He had been arrested, imprisoned, subjected to the strappado, his shoulders wrenched with ropes and pulleys until the joints gave way, on the suspicion of having conspired against the Medici, despite evidence that was, by most accounts, essentially nothing. He had been dismissed from the Chancery where he had served for 14 years and replaced by someone with better political connections and less dangerous competence. He was writing from a farm, broke and frustrated and brilliant, and completely sidelined to a court that had made clear it had no interest in him. The Prince was, among other things, a demonstration that he understood power, a proof of concept, a way of saying, you see, I know the rules of this game. Hire me back. That context does not explain everything in the book. The observations are real, the analysis is genuine, but it means that the person who wrote it was not a content tyrant strategizing from a throne. He was an underestimated nobody trying to make the case that underestimated nobodies sometimes see more clearly than the people in the room with all the power. And the whole arc comes back to that. The thing that gave Machiavelli his particular clarity was not access, it was marginality. It was the vantage point of the person who sat near the powerful long enough to understand them, and then was pushed far enough away to see them whole. From inside the Florentine chancery, running diplomatic missions, watching rulers at close range, he accumulated the raw material. From the farm in Sant'Andrea in Cesena, exiled and dismissed, he had the distance to make sense of it. The strappado, the prison cell, the years of being treated as a nobody by the people who now held power, these were not incidental to his thinking. They were the crucible it was shaped in, and what he came to believe, finally, underneath the unflinching realism of the prince, was that the structures that hold best are the ones that do not depend on any single person's cunning. That the most durable foundations are built on something wider, more shared, more lawful than the willingness of any one person to maneuver effectively among rivals. He knew the moves, he documented the moves, he was explicit about how the moves work and why. And then, in the Discourses on Livy, he said, "But the moves are not the destination. The destination is something better, something more broadly held." For the person listening to this in the dark, trying to figure out how to navigate a workplace they did not design among people they did not choose, with a manager who is sometimes opaque and colleagues who are sometimes difficult and a structure that was already in motion when they arrived, this is the resolution. You learn the moves because you have to know them to survive among people who are already making them, sometimes without even knowing it. You understand credit because you have seen what happens to people whose credit evaporates. You learn to read the powerful because the alternative is being moved around by forces you cannot see and could not have anticipated. You learn when to speak and when to stay quiet because the instinct to fill every silence with your own voice is often the thing that undoes you most efficiently. But the goal is not to become Cesare Borgia. The goal is not to find your own Ramiro, someone to absorb the odium while you keep the credit. The goal is not even to win the political environment in any lasting sense, because winning a political environment is not a stable state. It is a position you have to hold indefinitely against everyone who would like to hold it instead. The goal is the thing Machiavelli preferred when he let himself say what he preferred, something built on a wider base. Relationships that are real rather than instrumental. A reputation that is accurate rather than managed. A way of operating that makes you genuinely valuable rather than merely strategically positioned. The dikes built from real work and honest contribution, which have some chance of holding when the river rises, rather than the more fragile architecture of someone who has leveraged and maneuvered their way to a position with nothing solid underneath. He saw clearly, he wrote clearly, and he was misread, caricatured, weaponized, turned into a stock villain by playwrights who had mostly not finished the book, put on an index, and eventually had his name turned into a psychological diagnosis by researchers measuring something he would not entirely recognize. The gap between what he actually wrote and what the word bearing his name came to mean is one of the stranger stories in intellectual history. A man whose works were placed on the index of prohibited books in 1559, whose name had already been made into a stage villain by the Elizabethan theatre before most of those theatre-goers had read a sentence he wrote, whose reputation was formed largely by innocent Gentile's 1576 polemic contra Machiavelli, which argued against a version of his ideas that was already significantly distorted by the time Gentile got to them. And yet the book survived. It always survives because the observations in it are accurate enough, specific enough, grounded in enough real watching of how human beings actually behave under pressure, that each generation of readers finds something in it that maps onto what they are seeing around them. Not because human nature has not changed, though Machiavelli would probably say it has not changed much, but because the structural problems he was examining are remarkably stable. Who takes the credit? Who absorbs the blame? Who tells the truth and who tells you what you want to hear? How to read the person above you without letting them see that you are reading them. How to build something that holds when the circumstances shift. These questions did not originate in a Florentine chancery in 1513. They will not be resolved in any office you will work in during the years ahead. They run through the whole of human organizational life in every structure people have built for working together toward shared or competing purposes. Machiavelli just happened to be the person who sat close enough to watch and far enough away to think, and had enough of a writer's instinct to put it down in clear enough prose that 500 years later, a person lying in the dark can read it by the light of a screen and recognize without much difficulty the specific shape of the meeting they sat in last week. He wrote in chapter 25 that fortune can be compared to a rushing river which, when it is in flood, overwhelms everything, uproots trees, demolishes buildings, takes the earth from this side and moves it to the other. And yet, and here is where the sentence turns, everyone flees from it. Everyone yields to its force without being able to withstand it. And yet this does not prevent people, when quiet times come, from providing barriers and embankments so that when the river rises it would go into a channel and its force would not be so wild nor so damaging. The quiet times. The building of channels. The recognition that you cannot fight the flood when it comes, but that what you do in the ordinary hours before it arrives is not meaningless. It is, in fact, everything. Tonight, in whatever room you are in, whatever situation you are navigating, whatever combination of difficult people and unclear structures and shifting circumstances you are trying to hold steady inside, the river is probably somewhere at a manageable level. There may be signs it is rising, there may be floods you are still recovering from, but there is also, in whatever proportion is available to you, the other half, the part that belongs to preparation, to building what you can where you can with the materials actually in reach. And Machiavelli, the real one, the man who preferred republics, who was tortured and exiled and wrote from a farm with muddy hands, who spent 14 years watching the powerful up close and then got to watch them from further away than he wanted, that man would probably tell you that the most useful thing you can do with everything in this book is use it to see clearly, and then use that clarity to build something that does not require you to scheme to hold it. Not because scheming is impossible, he was very clear that it is possible, and he documented exactly how it works in a way that remains embarrassingly accurate 5 centuries later. But because what you build by scheming requires scheming to maintain, and what you build on something more solid, on genuine competence, on honest dealing, on a reputation that is accurate, on relationships that have some reality to them, that has a better chance of surviving the next flood, and the one after that. He learned this the hard way, from a rope attached to his shoulders in a Florentine prison, from years of letters to people who did not write back, from watching everything he had helped build get swept away in a single political reversal. The lesson was expensive for him. You do not have to pay for it the same way. We have spent this time with the chapters almost nobody quote. The secretary who thinks more of the prince than himself, the prince who cannot be well advised if he is not wise, the enforcer left cut in two in the piazza because he was useful for exactly one thing: the dikes built before the river rises, the timing of when to land the bad news all at once and when to let the good news arrive in a slow and patient drip. We have met the lion and the fox, And the third thing Machiavelli says you must never be, which is neither, which is hated. We have met the man himself, dismissed and tortured, and sent to a farm, turning all of it into the clearest-eyed book anyone wrote about power in that century, and then in the quieter work that followed, arriving at the conclusion that power shared broadly on a legal foundation is more durable than any prince, however skilled. You do not need to remember all of it. If one thing stays, let it be the question you ask before you take the job of hatchet man, before you let your best work become invisible, before you spend the quiet time not building dikes. The question is the same one Machiavelli kept asking across every chapter of that book, from every angle he could find. Not, how do I take what I want, but how do I build something that holds? One last sleepy beep before the dark. Good night.